We have a fantastic panel with a wide spread of expertise. I'll let themselves introduce themselves. Maarten?
Maarten van der Horst, I'm a designer.
I'm Matthew Henson, fashion editor of Complex Magazine.
I'm Hettie Judah. I'm a writer and editor specialising in fashion, art and design.
My name's Dan Thawley. I'm the editor-in-chief of A Magazine and a freelance journalist.
So before we start talking about J-Dubs, let's discuss yesterday.
I like that we're setting off with J-Dubs to keep it casual.
Let's I think it's good. I feel very fashion. So let's talk about yesterday. Highlights of yesterday, please. I mean, Craig Green for me was fantastic, and he sort of, you know, he's always been good, but yesterday he really seemed to come through, dominate the man show, deliver on the promise that everybody had been talking about. There was a
more
little
about
bit
clothes than it has been with him, I think.
Exactly.
You didn't need theatrics of masks and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but the silhouette was quite extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he hasn't shown dresses like that before. Because in previous seasons you could get like knitwear that was quite wearable and would fit the wardrobe. Now I was looking for pieces, but I really had to look for pieces. But it was definitely standout, especially the man show, but maybe the entire day, to be honest, I think.
I've quite enjoyed Alan Taylor on the Man Show as well, actually.
It was very good, yeah.
I mean, I think what he was doing was difficult and, you know, tricksy, and, you know, it was pulled off beautifully.
Yeah.
And there were some, you know, interesting things happening there. I mean, I think it was maybe more technical rather than, you know, out there and showy. But I thought that was definitely an interesting presentation from that show.
Okay. Any other highlights?
Well, we were speaking about man. I really like Bobby Abley.
Okay.
It was very fun. Bringing the street vibe, but I really loved the details. I loved the accessories, and I loved the simple outerwear that he did, aside from the prints. But I really loved the outerwear.
And I thought also there was something quite perversely beautiful about Jonathan Saunders. He did all these sort of satin silk tracksuits mixed with kind of quite cricket sweaters and tuxedo taping, and the colour palette that he does is always very bold, but this time it was quite oily, quite slick, olive and red, and I quite enjoyed it. There was kind of racing harlequin, jockey, equestrian vibe happening.
Yeah, there was a lot of that very kind of sheeny, slick texture going on all over yesterday. I mean, with Astrid Anderson's show as well, there was a lot of that heavy satin, and with Jonathan's as well.
I think there's a bit of a fear and loathing vibe going on after last season's Prada show as well, that's kind of filtering through perhaps.
Fear and loathing vibe?
I'm seeing a lot of aviators back, the bowling shirts as well, kind of flat 50s, 60s shapes.
Nice. Okay, and I think Saunders is quite interesting because he's very much like what the man who's into fashion but doesn't want to look like, you know, he gets it so right every time. He just leads at that point where the man who's into fashion but perhaps doesn't want to look kooky.
He doesn't play with difficult shapes. It's always quite basic, square, easy shapes, but it's all about what's happening with fabrication and colour, I guess.
And and I think that's quite different from J-Dubs because he, I like the segue, he's obviously playing with the whole feminine, masculine thing. What do we think about, like, because I was reading up on some of the history of it, and I sort of think there's 3 phases in his work. There's the first phase where he was very sort of obviously trend-led. Then there's the second phase where he looked like the guy that had worked at Prada. And then there's the third phase, which is kind of a bit, the whole famous androgyny phase. So, and I think in the second phase, it was about 2012, and he was talking about how it was a relationship with his mother. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it's quite interesting that you have this kind of, there's this whole idea that it's very gay to dress like a woman. But then there's this other idea, the romantic idea of being a man, and the two are so opposed. And yet, being in love with being a man is just as much about the romantic idea of being a man. But it's very interesting that because he doesn't relate to that idea at all. He's just about this kind of, I think he said the collection was about sleeping with his mother, which was kind of
The Oedipus collection.
yeah. So what do we think?
I mean, I don't necessarily see the phases kind of cut up in the way that you describe it, but I think he's somebody that's constantly looking for new ideas, new entertainment. I think he gets very bored quite easily, and he's almost like this kind of all-consuming machine where he's kind of processing ideas and processing influences and different aesthetics. In terms of the androgyny, of course, it's worth remembering that that works in the opposite direction as well. So he's not just doing very feminine menswear, he also does quite masculine women's wear as well. So I think that it's not necessarily to do with the statement about men dressing in not romantic way, but in a kind of very feminine way. It's also about kind of mixing it up from both sides.
Would you actually call his women's wear masculine though? I would almost say it's very aesthetic and quite sexless in a way, and he kind of manages to strip back the sensuality out of it a lot.
I would agree.
Very dry.
I mean, one criticism I've made to him in the past is that he doesn't know how to cut for this bit of women at all. So we're just kind of
that's definitely something
like that. And you saw with the last collection, the least successful pieces just had this kind of saggy curtain effect going on across the
bibs
chest.
and various.
Yeah. But on the other hand, he does do some very sharp tailoring. I've got some trousers and jackets by him that are, really nicely done, and they're very much looking at kind of 30s menswear or whatever. So he's got that basis, but I think that he's feeling the need to, rather than rest on the stuff he knows how to do, to constantly experiment and push himself.
Well, it's something he's always been very adept at is the commercial and the conceptual split. And when you go into a store that sells his collection, what you're mostly going to see is colour-blocked cashmere sweaters, as opposed to tricky leather tops with one armhole and that
You
sort
almost,
of thing.
You almost never see the very fashion pieces. Yeah.
Which
So I
is
think that's important.
a total shame, no?
Sorry?
That split is so uninteresting.
Yeah.
So uninteresting. I find it incredibly uninteresting.
But it's quite relevant now in terms of the way you have to be as a young designer, that you can have that basis.
I don't know.
How much is his, when he sort of really came strong about, I think it was early last year with the sort of, this is skirts, men in skirts. One, I sort of thought about that Prada collection from a few years ago with the tutus and stuff. And I just thought, well, it doesn't seem that new. But also I just wondered, is this just a marketing ploy? Because what it kind of felt like to me, to an extent, was advertised, because menswear is a much easier platform to broadcast on. And I wondered how much it was advertising for the women's wear.
I mean, I don't know about advertising for the women's wear, but he made the front page of so many newspapers with that collection.
It was tabloid news.
Yeah, it was the front page of Metro. It's from, I don't know who else, but that was the image that jumped out at you from the men's collections last year. And then, I mean, I thought it was you may see it as a shame, but I thought it was quite a kind of pragmatic thing where he basically went, okay, really, in real terms, only 10 pieces from this collection are going to get picked up. So why not really go out there with the other ones? But maybe it is more. He's a great businessman, I have to say that. I mean, he's pretty savvy in what he does, I think.
Yeah,
Getting there.
Yeah. But I think what he's doing is also, I think he's focusing for me, in terms of men's, I think, and women's wear, I think he's building a house instead of just looking at it from a business perspective. And I think that when you look back at these collections in a couple of years, it'll be like the most beautiful archive, because he's actually season to season carrying over so many ideas from the men's and the women's. And I think when we look back at this in a couple of years, it'll make a little bit more sense.
What I wondered though, but you being from New York, you might have something to say on this. I see something similar to Telfar.
Very much so, yeah.
But Telfar seems more successful because, Telfar wears the clothes.
Yeah.
Whereas J-Dubs doesn't. And I think it's quite interesting,
He does sometimes.
I feel like he used
He
to
does
more.
sometimes at the British Fashion Awards, at various things he will try out something a little bit more conceptual, I have to
But
say.
there
But
is
in
a
general, he
distance.
does. Yeah, it's more one of the designers that designs for others than for himself.
Because it's interesting, because he actually he was talking about how thighs are erotic. And, you know...
Telfar was, or Jonathan?
Jonathan was. He was talking about how thighs were erotic and how it's one of the most erotic parts of a man.
I agree.
And what was weird was because his dad is the rugby manager or captain for Ireland. And he actually referenced like a rugby guy. So that's quite interesting. Whereas Telfar is much more confident in his, sexuality, it seems. Whereas, Jonathan, I think, is not as confident, if more radical.
I think Telfar, his approach is a little bit more sportswear oriented. So it's easier to show the body when the materials are looser or when they're stretched and things of that nature. So I think it's easier for Telfar, and that's very much who he is. It's in his DNA. So for Jonathan, I think on the other hand, I think he wants to use more luxurious materials, and sometimes that idea of being sexy gets lost in translation.
I mean, the time I remember him wearing his own stuff was in fact, it was probably more like 2.5 years ago when he was doing those ankle-length pleated kilts. Do you remember those? And they were absolutely gorgeous. And then he also had these kind of little Angora tops, and that was seen much more of his aesthetic sensibility. It was something quite kind of luxurious and soft to the touch and flowing. But I think he's got this roving aesthetic, which maybe makes it quite difficult to... it makes it aesthetically inconsistent within his collection, but it no longer chimes necessarily with what he's wanting.
But I think Jonathan's positioning himself more as an observer and as the designer's designer outside of that, and to sort of... I think he's always had this obsession with, visual obsession with domesticity, which comes through in the way he does his sort of backstage imagery with a lot of the materials he uses in women's wear as well. Like last show was all these shower curtain dresses, and I think he likes to play with these slick patent sort of mental hospital kind of garments as well, this kind of surgical feeling. So I suppose... Wow,
please explain a bit more about this.
I mean, even... For example, the lead up to this show, all of the pictures were very sort of... I think he likes to enjoy this raw polish edge, and the pictures that he was using was sort of, a big pile of dressmakers' pins on a desk, very sort of rough and ready image, picture of the label with all of the details of his press office, sample only, all these kind of very, very basic, very fashion-oriented things that perhaps do stay behind the scenes and aren't very glamorous. And I think he quite enjoys playing on that aspect of things visually. Not that it necessarily always comes out in the garments, but I think it often comes out in his visual world. And particularly when you think about a lot of the references that him and his stylist Benjamin look at through their sort of visual history, the images of David Sims, a lot of 90s campaigns and all this sort of thing. I think you see that kind of that rawness, that hark back to heroin chic as well, which is kind of quite important in his women's wear, I think, at the moment, particularly when you're talking about those very stringy basic tops, these kind of odd bandana handkerchiefs, the things that just expose certain parts of the body. I suppose he also looks a lot at designers like Comme des Garçons, and I think that's something we'll see in this show as well.
You spoke to me yesterday about, you said, I think his stylist was right. You said that there was a massive sea change when he came along.
Benjamin Bruno is a French stylist. He was working for a long time with Corinne Roitfeld, and that I would say partly added a fetishistic element to the collections, but not in a particularly Corinne Roitfeld kind of way. And I think Benjamin has been a huge influence over the past 2 or 3 years on Jonathan. And I think they work very closely as a bit of a powerhouse together. And I think it's been something that's been really important for his brand. If you look back to what Jonathan was doing maybe around 2009, 2010, when you look at the Giant, he was doing this kind of Highland ball skirts for men. I remember going to the showroom and seeing pale green shaved mink slippers. He sort of played a lot he's always played on the Britishness of what he does, but I think back then he was looking at it in a very different way, in a much perhaps more glamorous way. There was also ethnic elements which you don't see anymore. He used to play with horse hair tassels and all these kind of wooden jewelry as well. And I think it's gotten a lot more cold, a lot more surgical, as I mentioned.
He seemed back then to be inheriting the Henry Holland sort of more like an artistic director, and more kind of, back then he seemed to be playing more like the role of how Nicola's become a kind of artistic director, as opposed to, and now he seems very much more a designer. I think because he was just hopping around at the beginning quite a lot.
I think his experimentation has just changed direction. I think it was a bit more widely culturally spread then, and I think now he looks much more at this, as I said, sort of making richness out of poor things as well, out of domestic things.
It's more technical, I think.
As well.
Yeah, it seems like the way the things that he's exploring is to do with kind of pleating and yes, creating sculptural shapes out of material.
And Matthew, in Complex, the one review I found said, while it made a statement about gender identity in fashion, one statement it didn't make is "wear me."
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the U.S., when before Dover Street Market opened, there was really only one or two shops that carried JW or JWs, as you guys say.
Menswear?
Menswear, yeah, specifically. And that was opening ceremony. And when you went to the store, you could only get those very commercial pieces that you were talking about, the color block sweaters. And that was pretty much it. And there was one flannel pant, the one that had the pleating pinstripe. That was pretty much it. And when you think about it, he shows so many looks, and there's so much clothes. And as a fashion editor, I mean, I would love to see some of those things in the stores, but people just in New York can't wear them. It just doesn't work out. The sweaters are beautiful, so of course that translates very well to everybody, but everything else is quite difficult to pull off. And you mentioned Comme des Garçons, and that's like one of the biggest, most popular brands in New York City. People always find a way to pull it off. Even the more conceptual, just pieces that you just see on the runway, people will endeavor to wear that in New York.
But again, Comme des Garçons is another brand which covers the bottom line, just like Jonathan's trying to do.
Of course, yeah.
They sell a hell of a lot of wallets and perfumes and basic black trousers and suits as well. So perhaps he's trying to go.
Obviously, with the Comme des Garçons show, you see one idea and it's properly developed. You don't all of a sudden see 3 silk halter necks.
No, that's true.
You know, like, I mean, if Ray is doing leather, she's doing leather. And there's obviously like 8 garments that you can easily wear that are really beautiful, and that's what I miss. With
I agree. The
JW
divide
Anderson.
is much wider with what he does.
Yeah.
And Maarten, because you did a Topshop collab like JW. I mean, I love that. I think it's, you know, and I love the Dover Street Market approach, and I love the fact that, you know, LVMH have invested in him. I love this kind of idea of almost like a record label model for fashion, you know, where the big brands are kind of investing in creatives and letting the creative be the star and then backing them up. But how was that experience for you, and how do you think he handled it as a collab? How would you rate what he did?
I find it incredibly difficult, and that's exactly the thing that I always struggle with JW Anderson, because what is his signature? And I didn't see his signature in Topshop, or I didn't see his signature in Versus. You know, so I don't know. That's a thing that I really have a problem with his work. And
I have to agree that Versus
completely
didn't come up to my expectations. Whether that's his fault or not is not something that we can say in the end. But I know that I was following his sort of lead up, his evolution digitally as well. He was being very public about going through the archives, getting very excited about it.
Yeah. And we got excited with him. And the thing is, I think his photographic research is always so interesting.
I have a feeling that it ended up somewhat to Versace's fault in turning it into a big New York party and turning it into a. I mean, you probably know better than we do,
but I do kind of feel like, and this is just me, I kind of feel like the Versus men's that he did was very true to him. It looked like his collection. Actually, it looked like one of his women's wear collections for men. And that was clear when I saw it come out, but it was definitely more about the party than anything else.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to see what Anthony Vaccarello does with the next one.
I'm so excited.
Well, it seems like much more of a, I mean, because Versus is such a kind of sexy brand,
Yeah.
and as we've been
Yeah.
saying, he doesn't really do sexy.
Yeah.
I mean, unless it's kind of like thigh fetishism,
Yeah.
something, quite
Yeah.
niche, but he doesn't do like big sexy in that
It was more
much.
a
Whereas
PR
Anthony
thing.
Vaccarello
Yeah.
really does sexy. I mean, he's
It was a PR thing, which is a shame, I think. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess he's. I mean, I thought a lot of the digital stuff around that was really exciting. A lot of
Yeah.
the social media around the whole Versus thing was really
Yeah.
exciting, and I enjoyed that. And I
mean,
really
he pulled so much iconic imagery of the early days, and that's again what I think he still continues to look at those kind of things in his own collections, but it didn't show.
One of the most curious things that he said about his menswear is that he thinks of men as columns, and this was why he was building these sort of long, slick silhouettes.
well. I mean, that goes back to classical architecture, though. So you've got the idea of the capital column, which is based on the ideal proportions of a masculine frame. So it's not something that's that out there.
Right.
So if you're talking about dividing a certain proportion up into chunks along the body, you could see with those collections that it kind of really worked with that classical sensibility of drawing the human form and the way that architecture is constructed around this idealized human shape.
Do you think he carries it through too much to women's wear?
Oh yeah, we're kind of back to my issue with his rejection of curves of any kind. I could start to look like a personal bugbear.
No, you're absolutely not the first girl that I've had the exact same discussion with. I was in a taxi last season, and there was two editors just absolutely distraught with the collection he'd showed as well, because they could not see its relevance to a modern woman. But at the same time, it seems like his editorial bent and the idea of the radical stylists seem to love it. I mean, he's getting incredible credits in incredible magazines.
I think because
But I would have to say that is quite restricted to the women's wear.
he's quite a good way of saying he's quite good shorthand for I'm really on trend, and I'm a little bit edgy without having, which is a good thing, without having to exhaust myself. I think you can wear his clothes and, a lot of the celebrities wearing it, somebody like Grimes wearing it, it's very easy to look, like you're edgy, like you're on trend, but without it being exhausting. Whereas a lot of designers' clothes, that whole kind of Lady Gaga moment from a couple of years ago, it was hard work, and it was, and you just sort of felt sorry for people that,
His stuff does get picked up and copied a lot, though, I have to say. I mean, it just sounds like a horrible defence to make, but I find that quite often I'll look at something he's done and go, that's quite nasty. And then 6 months later,
he has his own go-to labels as well, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more prominent.
his collections from a couple of years ago look better now, which I thought,
Like you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, I own one piece of J.W. Anderson, and it's kind of outrageous to talk about, but it looks really. It's a pair from one of his first collections. It's a pair of see-through silk shorts. They're black. They're completely see-through from top to bottom, and I just wear them with like a longer boxer short. And from far away, it just looks like a regular short, but close up, it's completely naked. And normally I don't dress like that, but for some reason I just feel very comfortable in it. But it's the one idea from his previous collection that works for me. And I really like it.
But I suppose it's important to think how those individual pieces can end up on an actual wardrobe. And I suppose his success with American department stores in general is a testament to that. The fact that he can sell out like sort of just over the knee length pink, Pepto pink sponge A-line skirts. Must say that it does fit somewhere in a cocktail wardrobe, certain things that he does, and poppy printed sort of knitted sweaters as well. I mean, there's certain ideas that indeed hit, but I guess we are there to look at the more difficult things, aren't we?
Yeah.
Why is he such a success? I mean, why is he, the guy that's got the house, the guy that's got the LVMH investment, the guy that, the press often unthinkingly, he's described by people like Susie Menkes as the star of London Fashion Week, as if it's a fact, without much justification. Why did he, because a lot of people like ourselves are quite willing to criticize him, but why is he done so well?
Because he's subversive, and it seems like he has everything in order. I don't know him personally, but it seems like he has an amazing team and some amazing financial backing, because
I wouldn't say that it's always been that easy for him, and I know from
no, but I don't know him
experience as well
personally.
that I think a lot of it has been through by the skin of the teeth for many years, and I think that the LVMH injection has been a much needed and much awaited help.
Sure.
And I would say that it's been really difficult, but you're absolutely right in the fact that he keeps a cool, and he's very stubborn and pig-headed in the way he continues to push what he pushes.
Yeah, and if you combine that with just, subversive, also obviously for the sake of being subversive, because I think that's sometimes
And
needed.
doing it here in London rather than
Yeah.
doing it elsewhere.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
think that's a very important part.
Exactly.
And again, it goes back to the way he uses certain British references, which perhaps seem obvious or make much more sense here, but do obviously seem more radical overseas.
And when I was saying earlier that I think he's a good businessman, I didn't mean that negatively. I mean, he, from a really, really early stage in his career, was doing 4 collections a year. He's doing much larger collections than other people of his age. So he's already looking like more of a professional proposition in terms of his output, even if, there are still problems in terms of, maybe his signature or in terms of his, wearability or the balance within his collections of the kind of avant-garde and the buyable.
But why did his clothes sell?
Well, if you
Because we're
If
praising
they
him as a
do.
we're praising him as a businessman. What
Yeah,
about
let's.
as a designer?
There have been things that I love. I mean, there are pieces that I've absolutely
But did you buy them
adored.
full price or did you buy them on sale?
I bought them on sale, or
Yes.
or if
I think that he's a
bought them.
designer that's
Yeah.
is pretty can confidently sell at 50% and
Yeah.
and 70%, like sell out. But I think that seasonal sales with him are pretty sort of selective, and I think that there's a lot of pieces that hang on racks, and I think, but that kind of goes back, if it makes sense, with the way that he does cycle through the collections and keep ideas going through across. I'm sure that some stores sell the menswear to women and things like that. I mean, it must work that way for him in his favor somewhat. But I wouldn't say that he's a commercial success just yet in terms of that.
Because I was really interested when you were talking about him selling very well in the States. I didn't know that was.
I wouldn't say I don't know selling so well, but I do know that he is placed in very good department stores, and you can see that online, and that whether it's a big buy or a small buy, that he does have the big players watching, and they are making small byways into supporting his brand, Net-a-Porter, these kind of people as well. So
Matthew, just as an aside, help us with our. I mean, Dan's not based in London either, but well, Dan, you can also join in. Help us with our kind of slightly patriotic British idea that we're the centre of menswear and in fact creating all fashion from Dalston for the world. and could to help us, like, how relevant is do people know who J.W. Anderson is in America?
They definitely do, and I'm going to get a lot of flack. I think I'm going to get a lot of flack for this when I get home. I think that the conversation of menswear is really, it's really based here right now. There's so many new ideas coming out, and there's so many people just doing what comes naturally to them and just expressing themselves and giving us really fresh ideas and different silhouettes and different ideas on how to style things. I think it's happening here, and I think specifically with JW, while New Yorkers en masse might not be able to wear something straight off the runway, I think people will try to take pieces from these collections and try to figure out how to make them work. Whether it works or not doesn't really matter, but I think people are trying. I think it's the main point of the conversation here.
Cool. And Dan, how's Paris thinking?
I'm not sure I could agree with that. I think that perhaps you're talking to a pretty solid creative microcosm with
It is, yeah.
and particularly when you continue to reference New York itself. I think it's a very, very special place.
Yeah.
And I think the menswear conversation goes much wider than London still, and I think London has a super long way to go, because commercially Milan and Paris still have the utmost relevance.
Yeah.
Who are
Well, they have
who
the-
on the street? or in jackets in Paris? Who are the menswear designers that get talked about?
They don't.
In the London menswear designers? None.
They don't.
So that's the British bubble burst.
And it's interesting because as well, I mean, young Paris men, I think, are very much being more attracted to the huge wave of contemporary designers that are really taking over in such a mass way at the moment. And I'm talking, of course, you have your Carvins and your Kenzos and these kind of things as well. But I think as well, the brands that are being supported on sites like Hypebeast and this sort of thing, your Woolrich, your even, I suppose, denim as well is so relevant right now. And I think that designer pieces are becoming more restricted to your accessories and your wallets. And I think young people are seeing the, I guess, there's a huge kind of level plateau at the moment where you can access certain runway and cool brands for the prices that aren't as high as your JWs and your young designers. I think there's that sad reality that they have such small production. Yes, of course, it's much more exclusive, but most people are going to opt for the.
What about in the corridors of Paris fashion power? In the corridors of the LVMH headquarters and the Vocom International. What are they talking about? London fashion at all?
I wouldn't say so. I think that Jonathan is probably one of the few that's on the radar. I think Berluti is having a huge resurgence in Paris at the moment. There's a lot of hype around this. If you want to talk about sartorial things, and I think with London also pushing that side of things a lot, I think Berluti is Paris's answer at the moment. Certainly the Arnault answer, the LVMH answer, and they're pushing that extremely strongly. But I think, young fashion professionals are also going to be looking to the contemporary brands just as much to get the more sort of the easier indulgent pieces, something that's not a half a month's salary, something that and then in sales as well. I mean, they're looking perhaps in their own houses, and I think Dior and Prada and all these kind of things are super relevant in Paris still. You still have this slim silhouette, a hoodie and a jacket, pair of jeans, and trainers.
Cool. Well then, can we look at the collection now, please? Thank you. Of our high-tech screen increasing. That's great.
Are we looking at the first look?
Dan, can you see that at all, or is it?
Yeah, it's okay.
Are you in a funny angle?
Can you guys see this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Martin, maybe we could start with the designer's eye.
Shit, man. I like his shoe. The thing is about Judah, I always like his hair. They always have amazing people doing the
Is
hair.
it Paul Hanlon does it?
It's either Paul or Mark Hampton.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, but yeah, that's cool.
So this sort of apron flag knitwear.
Yeah.
Well, there was a kind of medieval theme to the women's wear, so I guess you could kind of go with tabard.
Yeah.
Although it does look like a house.
Yeah.
It does.
That thick rib is a little bit, it falls a little bit. It doesn't quite have the structure that it could perhaps around the shoulders.
He's carrying a bucket.
And a bucket bag.
He's carrying a bucket.
And that piece relates directly into the women's wear
Women's wear,
collection, where he had those things that look like giant scarves, kind of.
It reminds me of the Chanel watering can.
Yeah.
But again, you were talking about him liking the kind of patenty, shiny feel, which is on there as well.
Has he done a heel for men before like that? I don't remember. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
He
I
had
can't remember
quite.
the shoe from last season.
So what do we
I
think?
can't remember the shoe from last season.
What do we think of the colours?
I mean, that's a very familiar palette from him.
Yeah.
Again, he loves the navy, camel, grey, white, and then to mix it up with something primary. Is that a bracelet?
Yeah.
I mean, that's more like previous collections.
Yeah.
Yeah, that length of trouser as well is.
I mean, to some
This could be a 50s women's wear look.
Yeah,
Sure, yeah.
it's very secretary.
Yeah, very secretary. Yeah.
I actually like those trousers.
Yeah.
Looks like his casting is also mixing up a little bit.
Yeah, it was quite boring before, wasn't it?
He's always almost had quite a very, very Aryan army of boys,
Yeah.
and this looks like a little bit of a change.
Yeah.
Also spectacles.
Actually looks like him. That's quite strange.
One proposition he does constantly revisit, which I think is quite interesting for the runway, is how he's mentioned that the unnecessary nature of always showing a black trouser or a plain piece underneath the show pieces, because it's expected that the man will wear it anyway. Like the idea that he can show this camel coat with no trousers underneath, which he's done before, and that those trousers, of course, a man's going to wear them anyway.
Yeah.
But what he wants to showcase for the show is the more statement pieces. I think that's kind of quite an interesting and relevant thing to say at the moment, because
Yeah.
we're all questioning the runway format so much.
But that's
as it is.
Benjamin then as well. Like that's
Mhm.
it. That's
Indeed.
their.
I mean, is this because I mean, for instance, that coat is obviously really very conventional, and it's the styling that's made it unusual. And it kind of, I'm kind of thinking, but still, I'd find it hard to buy into this idea. But it kind of reminds me slightly of the way people buy into Westwood, as actually very conventional clothing, but the whole kind of narrative around it says I'm odd and radical and contrary.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
It did. Does it say it now? Does Westwood say that now to you?
A lot of the older people who wear it, I think, wear it
suppose,
in that way. You know, it's like a little way of ticking a box. Whereas actually, it's a woolly jumper that's quite boring, but it has a Westwood thing, and that to them means a certain set of things. And I'm wondering if the people buying into J-Dubs, when they're buying a quite normal, average camel coat, are buying into that as an idea.
But who is buying that camel coat from Jonathan?
I don't know.
I mean, at the risk of sounding like one of the older people that wears Westwood, which I don't. But, I mean, I think that's actually doing it a disservice, because there's always a lot of some interesting stitching going on there. There's a bit, things fall in quite unconventional ways quite often, and I think that's also going on with his tailoring. He has got good tailoring skills, but in terms of just the small details and the proportions, okay, it wasn't like a massive standout piece, but it's not like, bam, there's a coat. There was proportionally interesting things happening there.
Is that a brooch or a badge
I think it's
or a patch?
it's kind of a little token. Oh,
I think that's a huge trend that seems to be coming through in the last few seasons, particularly Raf Simons, as well as with his women's and menswear, is the idea of transforming patches and badges and that being a very relevant form of adornment, even across bags.
Do we think the accessories will make it through, like the sort of bangles?
Well, of course, he's got another hat this year as well, hasn't he? He's doing Loewe, so he's going to have to start looking more at accessories in general.
Because I'm just thinking that something like that, that's really where people, I think, would be very happy to play with the gender thing, and I can imagine, that becoming a huge thing, and seeing lots of guys, wearing, what is to the wider world very feminine piece of
Well,
jewelry.
straight away, this reminds me of yesterday at Jonathan Saunders' show. He actually was wearing his roll of tape around his arm, and I think that's actually exactly what Jonathan Anderson's probably also referencing there. That idea of he does bring back that sort of metafiction of the designer into the garments. I mean, Raf Simons also done it recently at Dior. He's made these bracelets that look like a dressmaker's pin cushion.
yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right on the other side as
So
well. That
that's what
bracelet
that is, yeah.
There you go, exactly. So that's that kind of meta idea of the process into the garments is kind of quite important.
That was a bit of a genius observation.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great.
Very well.
Even this sort of new idea of a tie, there could be a women's bow undone as well.
But now, having seen these three
Wow.
looks, there's already so much more development, and always trying to. I like it when a designer tries to, help the audience understand where it's coming from. I don't know, it has a certain generosity which I really appreciate from a designer. And I think that's every season that's just lacking a bit from J.W. Anderson. I like that now that at least you see some.
And just
Oh,
to
now you see
comes
the back of
exactly.
the shirt. Yeah.
exposed back on that shirt. Yeah.
Exactly, and normally you would see just a shirt with the exposed
Mhm.
back, and that's it. And then all of a sudden we would go into rubber or whatever. You know,
Yeah, I
So you think
it-
he lacks lacks coherency in the styling?
it's
or?
coherence. It's this lack of trying to make things understandable,
I think he purposely tries to make things difficult a lot of the time.
which I
doesn't he?
don't like. I
Mm.
don't think that
Mm.
makes a good designer.
But it does
doesn't-
help for the shock factor that he has been riding on.
It helps with the shock factor, but it's hard to understand. I think you're right. I mean, it's nice to be shown how to wear it, and it's nice to be shown that this is this looks a much more realistic proposition than the last 2 or 3 collections, and I think that's quite, you know.
Not that I'm saying that everything has to be practical or completely understandable, but if you don't do that, there needs to be a certain poetry to it. You know, a certain something that entices you, something that, I don't know, like more of a mood, more of an atmosphere. That
Yes,
makes
his
sense.
moods are very subtle and quite hard to pick out.
Mm.
And even when one reads the press release that he'll give, it's incredibly vague
Yeah.
and subtle. But I guess it helps that he does keep bringing back certain pieces and ideas from past collections, like we're seeing these Basque sort of peplums again.
Mhm.
I mean, that was a great look.
But you know, as you were saying, that looks like a kind of, you know, an old women's wear.
Mhm.
It's,
But this color again is quite like surgical scrubs.
yes,
Very much so
yes.
medical.
And it's again, you know, it's one look in several colors, then another look
It-
in several colors.
Repetition is very
It's very boring.
It's very prevalent.
There you go.
There you go.
There will be another color.
What would you say that fabric is, Maarten? Is it like a jacquard or something like
I have no idea.
There's
It
a
does-
bit of
it
sort
does
of
look like a
Hero
silk
the Clown
jacquard.
to the
Mm.
silhouette.
that? Pardon?
There's a bit of Hero the Clown to the silhouette.
I
Very-
quite like if you look at the other silhouette, how
The
it's
band.
wrapped
Back,
like a bit of an
yeah.
obi belt at the back there. That's quite.
I
quite
do love that
beautiful.
silhouette though. Very,
The
very
shape.
It reminds me a bit of this Jill women's wear when he did this quite alpine collection. You remember these big A-line floral coats,
Mm.
and when Raf was at Josanda a few winters ago. They look a bit like poppies. Now the trousers have that slight flare that he did a few seasons ago.
Yeah, I was looking at those flares. It's very strange, very, and that is a kind of quite, I love that kind of Prada thing of doing something that only looks good much later. And those flares, I mean, I still couldn't wear them, but they seem to.
Do you mean
at
the
time.
The kind of Ice Storm collection.
About two, it
From
must
Jonathan
be
or
2
from
years,
Prada?
from Jonathan,
Uh-huh.
about 2 years
with
ago.
the very stiff and the zips
Yeah.
up the side and that sort of thing? Yeah.
Because he had built up shoes with that collection as well.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
Stacked. Now we have a little Chanel knit.
Yeah.
I think it is the jumping around does make it hard to believe in him sometimes, and that's you know sometimes gets in the way of seeing that the clothes are actually very good.
Absolutely. And that's also, you know, for instance, what I love about Greg Green. Like, you want to support him, and he really goes for, you know, one idea,
Mhm.
which I think is so much
Because when you see
gutsier almost.
when you see a person in a JW skirt, you are like, where's that skirt from? That's really great. Oh, that's brilliant. And yet presented as a collection, I never really, I don't enjoy it. But when you see a piece, I tend to enjoy it.
Here's these kind of wide envelope sleeves that he worked on in the women's.
And it's just on one side.
You can already see as well the development in the leather goods. That bag looks like a real handbag.
Yeah.
It's much more than the folded sort of little clutches he was doing before.
Has he sort of employed a team, or
There are definitely new hirings happening. Yeah, absolutely.
And the embroidery on that top, I guess, is a reference back to the straps that he was doing across things.
Mm.
So he's almost kind of embroidering his own archaeology onto the, or stitching his own archaeology onto the garments a bit.
So what's the sort of general feeling, what's the panel's general feeling about this, or the general feeling they're taking from this?
He's gonna sell a lot of pants.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they seem like proper pants this time. They seem constructed and tailored and like solid pieces of clothing, as opposed to sort of slightly ambiguous. What do we think of the general direction, Martin?
Yeah, I like it. No, I have no idea what to say.
Well, I think that the point that you raised earlier, that you don't feel that you know what his overall aesthetic is slightly being resolved in this collection. I think, isn't it? He's referring back to a lot of his earlier collections, but it seems to make a bit more sense.
Yeah.
And he's continued his commitment to extremely androgynous pieces, but I think that a lot of these, rather than being hysterical, seem quite translatable.
Well, he's you know, because I used to struggle a bit with, I was like, when he was sort of full women's, I was like, well, why wouldn't you just wear women's? And then I was thinking about that whole kind of, what a lot of the fashion kids used to call the tranina, which was this kind of idea that the boys would wear half women's clothing. And I thought, well, he's just making clothes for those people, but that fit men, so that kind of makes sense. And then this is sort of going back to the period just before he went full women's and merging that with, and I feel like he's merging his sort of mid-period with his recent stuff, and yeah, it looks a lot more successful.
These sweaters go back to that sort of idea of the sanitarium that he's been playing with, straight jackets and that kind of surgical feeling, and the idea of being blocked, and it's quite
Last season's men's had the one arm restrained in a lot of the looks.
I'd almost hesitate and use the word demure for many of the looks in this collection, which is something you don't usually want to associate with menswear, but at the same time it's also not the way that most you would usually put women's wear on men, in a demure way either, which is quite perverse. It's quite prim, yeah.
There's not much, you know, if you're saying that there's a hint of madness there, I thought it was, I saw Alex Matson's video, and I thought the video was, the collection was good, but I thought the video was particularly successful. And the video was all about madness, and there's not much. That's a brilliant look. There's not much control in menswear at the moment. You know, there was so much control 10 years ago. It was so much about control and
control from what
a
perspective?
kind of idea of you know, that style is so often connected to control and to discipline. And at the moment, menswear doesn't seem to be about
discipline. Do you
discipline.
mean that in a fetishistic sense, or in a more to do with a cerebral kind of?
Cerebral.
Okay.
Discipline as in, you know, it's about what you cut out. Style is so often about what you cut out.
So quite ascetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas at the moment, there seems to be, I mean, that's another, you know, it's a brilliant jacket.
There's quite a maritime feeling going through quite a lot of it, isn't there? Sailor feeling.
That's where the kind of, I think there's a touch of new romantic 80s
Indeed.
Spandau Ballet-ness about it.
Well, I did a little bit of back research and I found out, even though we can't hear it at the moment, the soundtrack's actually by Michael Nyman. So I think that would be adding quite an interesting element to the show, which we're perhaps missing right now. Going back to that perversion that we're seeing.
Explain, just in case people don't know who Michael Nyman is.
Michael Nyman is a composer from the 80s and 90s. He's working with a lot with film as well, doing soundtracks for Peter Greenaway and people like that. So I imagine it would be quite an eerie addition to these looks.
But yeah, so I kind of think there's a lot of this sort of, well, we're not in a control period. We're not in a disciplined fashion period, I don't think.
I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there's a huge confusion amongst young people today because of the lack of prescribed subcultures that they have to become a part of, and I think fashion itself has become one sort of without actually having any rules.
I think there's also a huge impact of social media as well. I mean, we're seeing so many fashion images on quite poor screens, and so in fact people end up kind of hankering after things that are quite evident. And the idea of these kind of very subtle details and the way that garments have, you know, elements that are very personal to the wearer just seems to have slightly flown out of the window until you're right at the kind of top end beyond fashion in a way.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of demand for things that are quite iconic, evident, blocky, graphic.
Well, the last Marc
People need
Jacobs,
icons.
the last Marc Jacobs Louis Vuitton show was very much about not doing that, wasn't it? It felt to me it was like very much about making a statement of not being like a Instagram collection.
Fairly out there.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
call that subtle.
I thought it was quite subtle in a way. I don't know.
But Marc is another designer who's always gone somewhat against the grain and tried to propose something against what's generally in the mainstream at a certain time, and that what he showed for his own collection and for Vuitton was very, very embellished and baroque, and at the same time had this odd streetwear punk edge to it that didn't really gel with most of the collections of the season, which was so much lightness and pleating and sort of very, very soft, swishy colours and lots of silk. And I think, would you agree, very, very overtly feminine, and he made something that was almost quite bulky, almost this football jersey feeling, and the Hawaiian. I guess that does make sense with certain other collections, but
What do we think to this three quarter length? There's a lot of this sort of three quarter length in menswear at the moment. I mean, would we call these sweaters?
The tabards.
Yeah, because I think they're quite difficult to wear, but I mean the length is very. There's a lot of it around.
it is difficult because you have to wear a long coat over it as well. If you, I was trying to wear.
I love mixing though. I love having a very, very short coat and a super long t-shirt.
But is
T-shirt,
this,
yes, but if it's a bulky knit underneath, it can be difficult.
But is this not going back more to the, I mean, I don't think this is his reference at all, but I think a lot of this length is coming from very oversized sportswear influenced tops. So more the kind of big things that Sean Sampson was doing, where you've got that kind of mid-thigh length, kind of like a big, giant, oversized sweatshirt.
But to some extent, when Sean Sampson did it, I know there was the connection with sportswear, but I felt
California and gridiron and all
I also
that
felt like
sort of
it's
thing.
done quite a bit just for rupture, just for sublime rupture. Of like,
He's very technically accomplished. But I mean, I just meant in terms of the length, that's kind of more where.
yeah.
We didn't really touch on these tops. I find them quite, I guess, quite an important silhouette, but I don't quite understand what's going on.
Well, I guess all that work he was doing with geometry a few years ago, where it was much more technically geometrical and slicing up the body on different angles.
You see, I felt a lot of that geometry looked quite East European. It felt quite kind of East European graduate or kind of obscure Belgian graduate, whereas this seems like a much more grounded collection.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Because I didn't really understand how he got away with some of that in a way, because it did feel...
Very tricky.
It felt like if it was from a college in Belgium, it wouldn't get him past certain doors.
It wasn't graduate.
Whereas this feels like, you know, real content. It feels like it's got real background, and you know, it's peculiar to him. It's him.
I quite like the cartoonishly oversized feeling of that. It almost looks like a giant garment being worn.
I guess also because it feels deconstructed more than, you know, like a study or something. It feels more.
I mean, actually, it's a weirdly and oddly wearable piece as well. If you had a kind of shirt and a normal, you know, as you were saying, you don't need to show it with a shirt and a normal pair of trousers underneath. But that actually it's you can certainly wear that as
I
a.
think if you
Like a
wore like
cape.
a sweater
Yeah.
underneath, it's like a
Yeah.
poncho or a cape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's have like long and luxurious rounding up comments. So Matthew, how will what are you going to tell the boys at Complex about J-Dubs?
Don't be afraid to show your ankles a little bit more. I mean, people in general and guys roll their pants when they're too baggy and it's a really great look. So I think you can buy a pant that's already done for you. And I really did like the jackets, like the barn jackets at the end, a little bit shorter and a shawl collar and then that simple one button. I think that's really easy for people to just pull that off the rack and buy it. I don't know so much about the accessories, the bangles in the bag. But,
I mean, those jackets, in isolation, I think with sort of much calmer look, I can see them. I can actually see them happening in a big way. So Maarten,
I think it's my favorite collection of him so far, or the least cringe festy one. Because normally for me it's just a total cringe fest watching his shows, and I still don't like the running order. 3 in that color. It's just
I think if it was broken
it's not
up,
right.
you'd like a little bit more.
Well, I'd like a bit of a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how you shoot a movie. You don't
Yeah,
do
yeah.
all the sex scenes, all the that's not how it works.
do we know his menswear stockist breakdown compared to his womenswear stockist? Do we know a rough whether he actually sells much menswear?
I don't think so much, no.
I do think of what is picked up sells out. I know that specifically, again, mentioning opening ceremony in New York, he didn't show any of the sweatshirts that were in the store on the runway, but there was this white sweatshirt with this beautiful graphic on the front. It was in the store for 2 days. And there was they had like maybe 8 or 9 of them in that one store, and they were gone.
Wow.
They were there one day and they were gone in a week. And then the same thing with the sweaters, but they specifically really just sell the tops.
I quite liked, just going back to the colours of the earlier looks, there's something quite Bauhaus about a few of the looks, the black, the red and the white.
It reminded me of
Again, like you said, a bit new wave.
the chair. I don't know if it was Marcel Breuer or one of the Eames chairs. But there's like an Eames chair that has the Mondrian colours or one of those guys.
Rietveld chair.
You're Dutch, you know about design.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's fantastic. I'm appreciative of Dutch design. It reminded me of that. Thank you, Martin. Which I'm not sure, which is why I'm feeling some sort of weird, because there's a 40s silhouette in there there's these strange Bauhaus colours or modernist colours. There's a bit of a clown thing going on, Ashes to Ashes. I'm feeling like there's some weird connection to the early 80s here somehow. I'm not quite sure what it is.
Quite a romantic collection. Strictly romantic.
It is quite. I mean, it feels like Catherine Hepburn about to go off golfing a little bit,
Indeed.
doesn't it?
I was thinking there's something almost secretarial, a bit grande dame at university.
But it's that kind of like sexless sexiness and this very etiolated figure as well. I mean, it's although we were talking about him slightly mixing it up on the casting side, it's still tiny frames all the way through. I mean, I was complaining about him not necessarily cutting for a woman's body, but I don't know if you're a man that's
Oh,
more
indeed.
than that. Does he work at all for you?
I'm not a column.
You're a different kind of
Yeah, I'm a different kind of column. Yeah.
Because those that length of trouser is really interesting, but
You have
pleated
to be a
trousers
little bit
you have
taller,
to be tiny to wear pleated
It's
trousers and get
yeah.
away with them. I mean, I think those are beautiful pieces.
Of course.
It's a very Japanese section.
Yeah.
I can't help but think of some of the first Dior silhouettes that Raf did here.
For sure.
So guys, I'm just gonna. Did we get questions from the public?
No reply yet.
Oh, okay.
Just really rude comments.
The cellular character really.
I was going to tease you guys with like really hard questions from the internet, from the hyper-connected masses. Any closing comments?
think it's reconciled a lot of the things that have come up in previous collections.
So we feel like this is the collection that's kind of making sense. You know, if everybody writes about how he's a conversation, about how he's a discussion, about how he's making statements. So we feel like the discussion's starting to come to some conclusions that make sense to us. That seems to be the consensus.
Yeah, well, I think he's now like proposing things instead of opening up a conversation. I feel like this collection is actually proposing a serious alternative.
I would have liked to see a bit more variety on the bottom half of the silhouette. I think the black trouser, the carrot trouser all the way through is a little monotonous. But there's so many different ideas happening on the top that perhaps it was a defined idea to start as a base.
Men buy the top though.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sick of skirts now anyway.
But we also have, I don't know about you guys, but it's hard to find trousers too.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think trousers are some of the most difficult things to get right.
Yeah.
And just proposing one isn't fixing that problem for us. But perhaps perhaps as you said, he's a go-to for tops.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
And then of the shoe, what do you think?
It reminds me very much of a recent Comme des Garçons women's wear shoe.
Yeah.
That again, the clown idea which came through in the ruffled tops as well. It's very clownish. I think these jackets are very beautiful with that shawl collar and the single button. It's
I
very
love that,
Balenciaga.
Yeah.
It's very Cristobal.
Yeah, it's great. And I think very easy to wear. I mean, you can imagine that in almost, you know, in that kind of Joy Rich context, you know, paired with something else.
It's still a markedly very feminine piece though as well, with that, the softness of the collar and the outside button, and that very soft shoulder silhouette.
But I think that's one silhouette that a lot of guys are opening up to, a bit more a more oversized jacket idea. It's becoming much more accepted.
Well, I think for quite some time, I mean, I remember when it swapped, you know, when back in the late 90s, you know, it was all about super tight top and baggy bottom. And then around 2005 or something, it swapped. So it became about the big top. A Carrie cassette player, Carrie described it as a lollipop silhouette. She said, all the boys I like are lollipops. So yeah.
What do we think the JW boy has in his bucket bag?
Extra pins, I think.
That's a
Tape
many.
measure.
Not food.
No.
I'm guessing
No
probably
snacks.
not.
Hair
No
product.
cakes.
A rugby ball.
Flat shoes.
But I guess it would give a new relevance to all of these looks to see them with trainers and to see them in a bit more of a street context. I think they could actually be quite realistic.
Well, hopefully the stylists will, you know, in editorial bring this idea through.
Oh, in London magazines, they certainly will. They love to do that, don't they?
All right, brilliant. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.